The Gospels of Matthew and Luke begin with the story of the Nativity of Christ. Mark's Gospel, quite differently, starts with the story of Jesus' baptism. There is no story of Jesus' birth in Mark's Gospel. We'll talk about that on the first Sunday in January when we talk about the baptism of the Lord and renew our own baptism. John's Gospel, quite differently from all the others, starts with a philosophical, cosmological, thoughtful, and theological explanation of the Logos, which is God's Word, and the Word is Jesus Christ. Here's how John tells the story of our beginnings. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was with God in the beginning. Through him all things were made. Without him nothing was made that has been made. In him was life, and that life was the light of all humankind. The light shines in the darkness, and the darkness has not overcome it. There was a man sent from God whose name was John. He came as a witness to testify concerning that light, so that through him all might believe. He himself was not the light. He came only as a witness to the light. The true light that gives light to everyone was coming into the world. He was in the world, and though the world was made through him, the world did not recognize him. He came to that which was his own, but his own did not receive him. Yet to all who did receive him, to those who believed in his name, he gave the right to become children of God, children born not of natural descent, nor of human decision, or a husband's will, but born of God. The Word became flesh and made his dwelling among us. We have seen his glory, the glory of the one and only Son, who came from the Father, full of grace and truth. John testified concerning him. He cried out, saying, "This is the one I spoke about when I said, 'He who comes after me has surpassed me, because he was before me.' Out of his fullness we have all received grace in place of grace already given. For the law was given through Moses, grace and truth come through Jesus Christ. No one has ever seen God, but the one and only Son, who is himself God, and is in closest relationship with the Father, whom he has made known to us." It has been a month of Sundays now since I have been making these virtual messages for us again, since the pandemic has shut down our in-person worship one more time. For my video this week, I assembled my film crew, my wife Lynn, who is creative consultant, and our son Dan, who is technical advisor, and we went together to an art exhibit of the paintings of Michelangelo from the Sistine Chapel, which are on display at the Convention Center in downtown St. Louis. The artwork which is on display here is life-size replicas of the paintings at the Sistine Chapel in the Vatican City in Rome, Italy. The replicas were created for a recent renovation of Michelangelo's frescoes, and they've been on a world tour since the project has been completed. Let me familiarize you with the subject matter of the paintings in this beautiful chapel, if you're not familiar with them already. But first, let me tell you just why I want to do this. As you look at the ceiling in the Sistine Chapel, you'll note that all of the scenes are from the Old Testament. In fact, the only painting which depicts Jesus himself is over the altar, and that's a very significant painting. We'll get to that in a bit. In his book, The Christmas We Didn't Expect, Pastor Don Mathis explains what I believe Michelangelo might have been thinking. He writes, "The glory of Christmas is that it's not the beginning of Christ. Long before that first Christmas, his story had begun. Not just in various prophecies, but in a divine person. Christmas may be the opening of the climactic chapter, but it's not the commencement of Christ. Christmas indeed begins as a conception before birth. We rehearse Mary's magnificent song of submission and the shepherd's visit to pay homage to her newborn son, and we read that she treasured up all these things, pondering them in her heart. For mere humans, no doubt, such is the stuff of our origins. Prior to earthly beginnings, we simply did not exist. But it's not so with the Son of God. His coming forth is from of old, from ancient of days. Unlike every other human birth, Christmas is not a beginning, but a becoming. Christmas isn't his start, but his commission. He was not created, he came. No other human in the history of the world shares in this peculiar glory. As remarkable as his virgin birth is, his pre-existence sets him apart even more distinctively, even as he is fully human. Not only did Christ pre-exist that first Christmas, he also pre-existed all creation. John's Gospel opens with the declaration, "In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. He was in the beginning. All things were made through him, and without him was not anything made that was." And so we celebrate Christmas, not so much as the birth of a great leader of God's people, but as the entrance onto the stage of human history of very God of very God. The artist proclaims this by showing us graphically how everything in history and prehistory was leading toward Christmas, and everything that matters in this life and the next emanates from the manger in Bethlehem and the cross on Calvary. And so, let me begin by telling you a little bit about the artist, Michelangelo. He was an interesting character who was commissioned by Pope Julius II in 1508 to repaint the vault or the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel. The work was completed between the years 1508 and 1512. The painted area of the ceiling is about 131 foot long by 43 foot wide. This means that Michelangelo painted well over 5,000 square feet of frescoes. It's said that Michelangelo was intimidated by the scale of the commission and made it known from the outset of Julius II's approach that he would prefer to decline. He felt he was more of a sculptor than a painter, and he was suspicious that such a large-scale project was being offered to him by enemies set up to make him fail. For Michelangelo, the project was a distraction from the major marble sculpture that had preoccupied him for the previous years. That being said, it is said that he was actually only asked to paint depictions of the 12 apostles in the arches of the ceiling, and he only agreed to the project if he could have free rein. By the way, Michelangelo was a poet in addition to being a painter and a sculptor. Here's a poem he wrote to a friend about the experience of painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling. "I've already grown a goiter from this torture, hunched up here like a Lombardy cat, or anywhere else where the stagnant water's poison. My stomach squashed under my chin, my beard's pointing at heaven, my brain's crushed in a casket, my breast twists like a harpy's, like a mythological bird-like creature. My brush above me all the time dribbles paint, so my face makes a fine floor for droppings. My haunches are grinding into my guts, my poor backside strains to work as a counterweight. Every gesture I make is blind and aimless. My skin hangs loose below me. My spine's all knotted from folding over itself. I'm bent taut as a Syrian bow. Because I'm stuck like this, my thoughts are crazy, perfidious tripe." He could have said treacherous tripe, and it might even have been more poetic. "Anyone shoots badly through a crooked blowpipe. My painting is dead. Defend it for me, my friend. Protect my honor. I'm not in the right place. I am not a painter." Ironically then, with this attitude in mind, the artist's paintings at the Sistine Chapel are perhaps the most iconic of all paintings. The life-size replicas of the frescoes from the Sistine are here on display at the Convention Center in downtown St. Louis from now until January 10th. When we attended the exhibit on a recent weeknight, we virtually had the whole place to ourselves, which was fabulous. However, I hope more people take advantage of this unique opportunity. It instills a true feeling of awe to be able to stand toe to toe and face to face with such history, grandeur, and significance. I hope that my personal virtual tour gives you a bit of the same feeling. As I encounter the artwork close up, I'm thinking that these paintings were created before the Bible was ever translated so that common people who didn't know the language of Greek or Hebrew could read them for themselves. And so, besides the obvious reason the church celebrated the arts, which is to encourage the expression of creativity that exhibits the image of our Creator, the artwork adorned cathedrals in order to communicate the biblical story in a manner which would make it accessible to the general public. And so let's begin our tour. Here's a chart to help me explain to you the scheme of things, and then we'll look at it in a bit more detail. Of the present scheme of frescoes, the earliest part is the side walls, which don't get as much attention as the ceiling. They depict the life of Moses on one side, the life of Jesus on the other. Around the arched tops of the windows are areas known as lunettes, which contain the ancestors of Christ, painted by Michelangelo as part of the scheme for the ceiling. In the borders of the ceiling are paintings of major biblical prophets and sibyls. Sibyls are ancient seers who, according to tradition, foretold the coming of Christ. In the four corners of the room, there are scenes depicting the salvation of Israel. In my own personal view, the genealogy of Jesus serves to reassure us that God is at work in human history. In our lives and our relationships, God is working a plan which God has envisioned since before the beginning of time. Jesus is born in the lineage of King David. We know that Michelangelo understands the importance of David, since he's also famous for the grandiose statue of the monarch. David was the one whom the Bible said was the man after God's own heart. He was the one who slayed the giant Goliath as a lad with only a slingshot. This was to show that the true power came from God and God alone. The scriptures promise that God will establish David's throne forever. We now know, and the frescoes on the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel graphically depict, that God was actually referring to God's own kingdom, which would be established through Jesus, the King of Kings and the Lord of Lords. Now concerning the lineage of Christ, Matthew's Gospel, so does Luke's Gospel too, but in particular Matthew's Gospel begins in the first chapter, the first 18 verse, with a long list of the ancestors of Jesus. I'm not going to bore you by reading it to you now, but it is interesting, and I hope this little video will help you to take a fun look at Jesus' genealogy.
Abraham had Isaac he had Jacob he had Judah and his kin. Well, then Perez and Zerah came from Judah's woman Tamar. Perez he brought Hezron up, and then came Aram, then Amminadab, then Nahshon, who was then the dad of Salmon, who with Rahab fathered Boaz. Ruth she married Boaz, who had Obed, who had Jesse he had David, who we know as king. David he had Solomon by dead Uriah's wife. Solomon, well, you all know him. He had good old Rehoboam, followed by Abijah, who had Asa. Asa had Jehoshaphat, had Joram, had Uzziah, who had Jotham, then Ahaz, then Hezekiah. Followed by Manasseh, who had Amon, who was a man, who was father of a good boy named Josiah, who grandfathered Jehoiakim, who caused the Babylonian captivity because he was a liar. Then he had Shealtiel, who begat Zerubbabel, who had Abiud, who had Eliakim. Eliakim had Azer, who had Zadok, who had Achim. Achim was the father of Eliab. Then he had Eliezer, who had Mathan, who had Jacob. But listen very closely, I don't want to sing this twice. Jacob was the father of Joseph, husband of Mary, mother of Christ.
This I found very interesting. I hope you do too. There are 5 female prophets known in ancient Greek culture as sibyls in the border artwork of the ceiling. Their presence here depicts a shift in theology in the time of the Renaissance. Along with the sibyls, the artist also paints the images of 7 major biblical prophets. And the presence of both together represents a dawning awareness that there is no separation between the sacred and the secular. God is all and in all, and I think that's an important message. I won't tell about all 7 prophets in the context of this message. That would take a while. But I do want to highlight 4 of them that I think are important in the history of our salvation leading up to Christmas and to Christ. The prophet Zechariah is portrayed near the entry of the chapel in a place of prominence because his vision of the coming of the Messiah was one of the first ones. The best known prediction of the prophet is referred to by Jesus himself before his triumphal entry into Jerusalem, leading up to the crucifixion. It should cause us to think of Palm Sunday. Zechariah writes in chapter 9, verse 9, "Rejoice greatly, O daughter of Zion. Shout, daughter of Jerusalem. See, your king comes to you, righteous and having salvation, gentle and riding on a donkey, on a colt, the foal of a donkey." Zechariah also writes in chapter 10, verse 4, another prediction of the Messiah. "From Judah will come the cornerstone, from him the tent peg, from him the battle bow, from him every ruler." And Zechariah chapter 14, verse 9, "The Lord will be king over the whole earth. On that day there will be one Lord, and his name the only name." It's a bit of an interesting piece of lore to note that the artist gave Zechariah the face of the Pope who commissioned him to paint the ceiling as a compliment. Next, I want to lift up the painting of Isaiah which Michelangelo presents in the ceiling frescoes. It's impossible to overstate the prominence of the prophet Isaiah in biblical culture. His writings are among the New Testament writers' favorites. It hardly seems possible for you and me, this side of the birth of Christ, to think about anyone else but Jesus when we read these words from the Old Testament prophet's writings. He says in Isaiah chapter 52, beginning at verse 13 then, "Who has believed what he has heard from us? And to whom has the arm of the Lord been revealed? For he grew up before him like a young plant, and like a root out of dry ground. He had no form or majesty that we should look at him, and no beauty that we should desire him. He was despised and rejected by men, a man of sorrows and acquainted with grief. And as one from whom men hide their faces, he was despised, and we esteemed him not. Surely he has borne our griefs and carried our sorrows, yet we esteemed him stricken, smitten by God, and afflicted. But he was pierced for our transgressions, he was crushed for our iniquities. Upon him was the chastisement that brought us peace, and with his wounds we are healed. All we like sheep have gone astray. We have turned, every one, to his own way, and the Lord has laid on him the iniquity of us all." Or how about this one? Isaiah chapter 9, beginning at verse 5. "For every trampling boot of battle and every garment rolled in blood will be burned as fuel for the fire. For unto us a child is born, unto us a son is given, and the government will be upon his shoulders, and he will be called Wonderful Counselor, Mighty God, Everlasting Father, the Prince of Peace. Of the increase of his government and peace there will be no end. He will reign on the throne of David and over his kingdom, to establish and sustain it with justice and righteousness from that time and forevermore. The zeal of the Lord of hosts will accomplish this." Also remembered in the grand sweep of the story of our salvation in these marvelous paintings is the prophet Jeremiah. Jeremiah has been described as the weeping prophet because he foresaw the fall of the culture of his day. God also granted him a vision of a better day, which the prophet told of in these beautiful words in chapter 31. "The days are coming, declares the Lord, when I will make a new covenant with the people of Israel and with the people of Judah. It will not be like the covenant I made with their ancestors when I took them by the hand to lead them out of Egypt, because they broke my covenant, though I was a husband to them, declares the Lord. This is the covenant I will make with the people of Israel after that time, declares the Lord. I will put my law in their minds and write it on their hearts. I will be their God, and they will be my people. No longer will they teach their neighbor or say to one another, 'Know the Lord,' because they will all know me, from the least of them to the greatest, declares the Lord. For I will forgive their wickedness and will remember their sins no more." One more of the prophets depicted here by Michelangelo as part of the sweep of human salvation history that I would like to lift up is the prophet Daniel. He certainly is included among the prophets on the ceiling because he is one of the boldest and most colorful and exemplary figures in the scriptures. He refuses, along with his friends Shadrach, Meshach, and Abednego, to worship the Babylonian king while in exile because of his unswerving devotion to God and God alone. His friends are saved from the fiery furnace, and Daniel himself is spared from the lion's den to show how God protects and provides for the faithful. Daniel is also the first and the most major book in the Bible to speak of the apocalyptic or end times. God grants the prophet a vision of the end of the age, which will give way to God's new age. Daniel writes in chapter 2, "In the days of those kings, the God of heaven will set up a kingdom that shall never be destroyed, nor shall the kingdom be left to another people. It shall break in pieces all these kingdoms and bring them to an end, and it shall stand forever." Certainly, Michelangelo is telling us in this masterpiece that Jesus is the one who has brought this kingdom to pass. I also think that there's a special significance to including the prophets in the masterpiece, which depicts salvation history. The prophets were God's servants who were endowed with a vision of hope and the conviction of God's faithfulness. It was a major function of prophecy to speak up about injustice and to speak truth to power. Prophecy also had the purpose of providing inspiration to the people of God in their most desperate times. This seems like a timely message to me in these days of the coronavirus pandemic. Now then, in each of the four corners of the masterpiece, which is the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, there's a scene from the history of the salvation of Israel depicted. Here is a scene from the story of the book of Esther, in which the bad guy named Haman, who aspired to eliminate the Jewish race, is executed on the same gallows which he built to carry out his scheme. This whole marvelous story is acted out each year in the Jewish festival of Purim. This is just one more example of the way that Michelangelo graphically reminds us that what God is doing for humanity through Jesus is a significant turning point in the story of salvation. Everything which God has planned for God's creation leads to Bethlehem and emanates out of Bethlehem. Here's how the Apostle Paul drives home the point that I'm trying to make in this week's message. It's in the book of Colossians in chapter 1, beginning at verse 15. Paul writes, "Jesus is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn over all creation. For in him all things were created, things in heaven and things on earth, visible and invisible, whether thrones or powers or rulers or authorities. All things have been created through him and for him. He is before all things, and in him all things hold together. And he is the head of the body, the church. He is the beginning and the firstborn among the dead, so that in everything he might have supremacy. For God was pleased to have all his fullness dwell in him, and through him to reconcile to himself all things, whether things on earth or things in heaven, by making peace through his blood shed on the cross." I find this next part very interesting. Here is the artist's depiction of Jonah. It's said that the Pope wanted Jesus painted front and center as the main fresco as one looked upward from the altar. Instead, Michelangelo painted Jonah. In the Christian tradition, the prophet Jonah symbolizes resurrection from death after 3 days and nights in the belly of the fish. He returns to Nineveh to do God's will, and this reminds us of the 3 days which Christ spent in the tomb prior to the resurrection. Many have noted as they look at Jonah above the altar as the centerpiece of this great artwork that he seems to be leaning back himself, looking up at the ceiling, trying to take a good look at all that has been painting. This is also a painting of the great fish nearby Jonah, which is just a bit of whimsical humor from Michelangelo. Now we're nearing the end of this dramatic message, and it's depicted down the very center of the ceiling of the Sistine Chapel, where the artist gives his very own iconic depiction of the history of creation. The paintings which Michelangelo envisioned here are some of the most recognizable and cherished images of God and God's interaction with humanity that the world knows. Being able to walk along the path of this artwork as it hung just a few feet above my own head made me feel awestruck, as I had what I imagined was the very same vantage point that the artist must have had himself as he created the paintings. The most recognizable of all these paintings has to be the reach and near connection between God and the first man, Adam. The Bible presents Adam as the first man and gives the Lord Jesus Christ the curious title of the last Adam. This masterpiece emphasizes the relationship between Jesus and Adam as the most important relationship in all of history. It is central to the gospel and what Jesus came to do. We can therefore do no better than to end with the Apostle Paul's explanation of what these men did that has the utmost impact on our lives today. I'm reading from the Message Bible. Yet the rescuing gift is not exactly parallel to the death-dealing sin. If Adam's sin put crowds of people at the dead-end abyss of separation from God, just think what God's gift poured through one man, Jesus Christ, will do. There is no comparison between that death-dealing sin and this generous, life-giving gift. The verdict on that one sin was the death sentence. The verdict on the many sins that followed was this wonderful life sentence. If death got the upper hand through one man's wrongdoing, can you imagine the breathtaking recovery life makes, sovereign life, in those who grasp with both hands this wildly extravagant life gift, this grand setting everything right that the one man Jesus Christ provides? Here it is in a nutshell. Just as one person did it wrong and got us all into trouble with sin and death, another person did it right and got us out of it. But more than just getting us out of trouble, he got us into life. One man said no to God and put many people in the wrong. One man said yes to God and put many in the right. Romans chapter 5, verse 15 and following. When I say that this masterpiece depicting God and Adam reaching out to one another is iconic, what I mean is that it has entered our contemporary culture in a recognizable way. This is so well illustrated in a story I recently came across in a newspaper from Ireland. An Irish nurse has made an amazing version of the famous Michelangelo painting wearing gloves from the Sistine Chapel ceiling. It was inspired by her time working on the COVID-19 wards at a Dublin hospital. Chloe Slevin, a nursing student at University College Dublin and an artist, created the separation of Adam as a response to her experiences during the crisis, and she's now looking to sell it as a fundraiser for children's ambulance services. Chloe says her painting highlights the isolation that she's witnessed every day among people, whether it's between patients and staff or those isolating from family and friends. People are isolating and they're being separated more and more. There are people visiting family members through windows. Restrictions are a hard thing to discuss. Personally, she says, I'm trying to restrict my movements more than recommended, even with all the public advice. Chloe's also a campaigner for better pay for nurses. She says, I've had nursing students come to me saying they're starving themselves because they can't afford a bus to get home. They're skipping lunch to afford a train ticket, or else they're kicked out of their houses and they can't afford rent. It's an insult, she says, when we're given a round of applause, but it's just empty. Praise doesn't help us pay the rent. In Christ, the second Adam, God is reaching out to us in a manner which must inspire us to reach out to one another also. This is precisely what the self-giving gift of the Christ child means for us and the salvation of history. And now we come to my favorite part of the artwork in the chapel, and the best part of this exhibit as I see it. It is the painting of the Last Judgment above the altar. The Last Judgment was painted by Michelangelo from the years 1535 to 1541, more than 20 years after painting the ceiling. Here is depicted the second coming of Christ on the Day of Judgment, as described in the book of Revelation and also in Matthew 25. High on the wall is a heroic figure of Christ, with the saints clustered in groups around him. The painting is significant for many reasons, and one of them is that the artist's depiction of Jesus doesn't look anything like later paintings depicting the Savior. Michelangelo's Jesus is muscular, and he looks like a formidable opponent for the demons assigned to hell, which are on his left hand. The angels of glory are blowing their trumpets to announce the arrival of God's acceptable day. The Last Judgment was an object of a bitter dispute between Michelangelo and many of the church officials of his day. Some of the church officials accused Michelangelo of immorality and obscenity because of the nudity he depicted. A censorship campaign was organized, which was known as the Fig Leaf Campaign. An assistant to the Pope named Biagio da Cesania, I think I said that right, said it was most disgraceful that in so sacred a place there should have been depicted all those nude figures exposing themselves, and that it was no work for a chapel, but rather for a tavern. In response, Michelangelo worked de Caesaria's semblance into the scene as Minos, judge of the underworld. It's said that when he complained to the Pope, the pontiff responded that his jurisdiction did not extend to hell, so the portrait would have to remain. De Caesarea even earned a pair of donkey ears from Michelangelo. Nudity in Christian art is meant to represent a return to the innocence in the Garden of Eden, which Adam and Eve had before they disobeyed God and learned to be ashamed. Sin and shame are removed by the grace of God, but it's probably best to keep your clothes on. After Michelangelo died 24 years later, after he completed the Last Judgment, an artist was commissioned to make the painting more modest. Well, it's my opinion that the depiction of Jesus returning at the end of the ages to establish God's reign on earth is a fitting tableau for the altar. It's also a fitting way to conclude this Christmas message. This is the season for giving, and such a giving spirit is just what Matthew's Gospel calls for when we consider Christ's return. When the Son of Man comes in his glory, and all the holy angels with him, then he will sit on the throne of his glory. All the nations will be gathered before him, and he will separate them one from another, as a shepherd divides his sheep from the goats. And he will set the sheep on his right hand, but the goats on the left. And then the king will say to those on his right hand, "Come, you blessed of my Father, inherit the kingdom prepared for you from the foundation of the world. For I was hungry, and you gave me food. I was thirsty, and you gave me drink. I was a stranger, and you took me in. I was naked, and you clothed me. I was sick, and you visited me. I was in prison, and you came to me." Then the righteous will answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry and feed you, or thirsty and give you drink? When did we see you a stranger and take you in, or naked and clothe you? Or when did we see you sick or in prison and come to you?" And the king will answer and say to them, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it to one of the least of these my brethren, you did it to me." Then he will say to those on the left hand, "Depart from me, you cursed, into the everlasting fire prepared for the devil and his angels. For I was hungry, and you gave me no food. I was thirsty, and you gave me no drink. I was a stranger, and you did not take me in, naked, and you did not clothe me, sick and in prison, and you did not visit me." Then they will also answer him, saying, "Lord, when did we see you hungry, or thirsty, or a stranger, or naked, or sick, or in prison, and did not minister to you?" Then he will answer them, saying, "Assuredly I say to you, inasmuch as you did it not to one of the least of these, you did it not to me." And these will go away into everlasting punishment, but the righteous into eternal life. And that would be all except for one more thing. Actually, two more things, but who's counting? I'd like to introduce you to Emily Bugg and Billy Lewis. The pair were supposed to be married recently in an elaborate affair. The pandemic squashed all their plans. Emily and Billy could have become despondent, but that's not how they roll. This couple took their $5,000 non-refundable deposit and asked their caterer to box up all of their really good food and put it into single-serving containers, which they in turn delivered in person to the hungry and the underprivileged neighbors in their favorite charity. Now that's the spirit of giving which the holidays are meant to inspire. I want to take this opportunity to acknowledge all of you, members and friends of St. Martin's United Church of Christ in Dittmer, Missouri, for the way that you roll. This loving and giving congregation is renowned in our community for making Christmas special for about 100 or even more families every year. I know how much you enjoy taking a tag off of our giving tree and shopping for a gift as a way of lighting up the life of a perfect stranger who is also your neighbor at Christmas time. My office is generally so full of giving that I can't even walk to my desk at this time of year. Well, the pandemic was set to also interrupt that act of unselfish generosity. But we hatched a different plan. Thanks to you, 100 families are once again going to be blessed with the love of Christ this Christmas by receiving a shopping spree at the local Walmart, all the while wearing their mask and keeping their proper social distance. Thank you, and God bless you for giving. Sharing like this is exactly what God, who gave God's only begotten Son at Christmas and at Calvary, expects from us. Merry Christmas.